So I found this article, Indiana University news section, talking about how white flight is a racial phenomenon. It is not a socioeconomic one. It talks about how whites, they don't fly from poor non-whites. They fly from all non-whites, right? Once a neighborhood becomes non-white enough, they just start moving out. Now, this is no surprise to any of us. One of the researchers says, quote, white flight is actually more likely to occur in middle-class neighborhoods rather than in poor neighborhoods, end quote. Not a surprise. Middle-class whites are going to engage in white flight more than poor whites because they have the disposable income and a lot of times more money saved up so they can take the hit that comes with moving away from encroaching non-whites. Poor whites often just simply can't afford it, or they take a longer planning period to build up to it. White people are forced to pay to keep up the constant flight. They move into a white area, watch it become non-white, pay to move out to a new area before it too starts to change. There's less and less space for whites every year. The average American moves about 11 times during their life. The difficult part of this, for the whites who flee, they flee for racial reasons. We know this statistically, we know this scientifically. Often the fleers don't know it, though. That is a very hard part. As the community becomes more non-white, they feel less safe. They feel less at home. They feel less welcome, and they don't know why, for many of them. There are lots of old white people who would tell you about how they used to leave their door unlocked, or they used to leave their keys in the car. The area they live in, it used to be better. And they can't exactly put their finger on why it has changed. If you go to some areas, some very white areas, that life they describe still exists. There are smaller, basically 100% white communities across the United States where you go to the bar and the cars at the bar are largely unlocked and a lot of them have their keys in them. After all, if you were at the bar drinking and someone needed to move your car, well, you couldn't do it. You'd just leave your keys in there. They could move your car if they needed to. In many of those communities, kids go home to their houses and their front doors are unlocked. Even if the parents aren't there, many of the doors are unlocked. I never carried a house key as a kid. Now, one of my parents was generally there, but they might be there like across the street at the neighbor's house, or they might be in the backyard working. Just because they couldn't keep an eye on the house doesn't mean that they would lock it up. Maybe they'd even be inside taking a nap, meaning unconscious, and they still didn't feel the need to lock everything up. But in modern diverse areas, many white people lock the door all the time, not just before they leave. They'll lock it as they come in. So they're actually in the house and everything is locked up tight. What many of these old white people don't realize is they're not just thinking back to a better time, they're thinking back to a more homogeneous time. They're thinking back to a whiter time where people were more like each other. The more people are like each other, the more we can easily share common norms and values. So if you want to find those times that the old whites used to talk about, just look for a white as community as possible and make sure it's not a travel hub, it's not on an interstate or major highway. You don't want a bunch of outsiders constantly stopping for gas in the middle of the night. If they really are amongst themselves without much outside influence, that's where you'll find what the old timers talk about. That's where you'll find all the cars with the keys in them and the front doors unlocked. I recently spoke to a woman. She had gone to Europe, Italy, recently. She found it nice. She had a good time. She felt very comfortable there. It had a positive feeling about it. But then she was harassed by some scammers on the street, and pretty much every time that she was harassed by a scammer, it was a non-white, generally some sort of Middle Eastern. And she hadn't realized right away that outside of the scammers, that she had been having such a good time, and everyone around her was white. White people who aren't forced to learn about race often simply kind of ignore it. They walk into an area where they feel safe, they feel comfortable there. They go to a different area, and that area they feel vulnerable, they feel anxious. They don't pay attention to the obvious racial differences between those two areas. It's just a good area and a bad area. A good time for an area or a bad time for an area. Of course, we know, though, people make areas bad. But here's the thing, white flight is a hell of a problem, and I don't mean it like the leftists say it. They say it's a problem because we're evil for doing it. They're furious because it kind of disproves their whole worldview about diversity. If whites would rather completely uproot than enjoy diversity, it's probably not that good. Even if it costs us money to do it, money that some of us struggle just to get so we can afford to leave. Now, white flight is a problem for me because it prevents racial consciousness. Who are the white people with the most racialist view in the United States? Ask people, they'll tell you. They'll probably say, hey, it's poor Southern whites. They might even use some slurs, call them rednecks or something, hillbillies. The most racial whites are the ones who are most exposed to diversity and can least afford to flee from it. When race has been shoved in their face and they can't run from it, they have to learn. They learn a racial view. Race has a huge impact, and they don't have the luxury to run away from it and avoid learning about race. They must accept what is directly happening to them. It's fairly obvious to see. It's kind of like the fact that a lot of very wealthy people don't ever need to learn about plumbing, electrical, carpentry, auto mechanics. They don't have to learn about any of that stuff. They can afford to avoid it. If you're poor, you often have to at least somewhat learn about some of those things because you can't always afford to have servants, plumbers, and electricians do everything for you, and you can't always afford to escape diversity. But here's the thing, there is a less obvious white flight that constantly goes on. You can see it in places like Atlanta. Now, Atlanta is about 1/3 white, or right around there. Many of the whites still don't have a racial worldview. Now, one obvious point is that there is a definite white part of Atlanta that they're sort of congregating in. So there's white flight within a city or town, but there's also a white flight that they engage in that isn't so outwardly apparent. Often in city centers where things are diverse, or on the edges of white areas where things are a little bit more diverse, the whites engage in white flight in a different way. And all you need to do is walk the streets with a racial worldview, and it becomes easily apparent. You walk by the barbershop, the black barbershop, and the white who might walk in there gets a very stern look. Instead, he goes to a chain hair salon or something like that where nearly everyone is white. He goes to a white tap room or bar where nearly everyone there is white. The white men and women in that area, they don't really like public transport. They'll tell you why. They'll say, oh, it's dirty, it's inconvenient. It doesn't go to the places that I always want to go, and it doesn't take me at the times that are most convenient for me. Instead, they end up driving their car in circles looking for parking. Ooh, that's real convenient. There's white flight from public transport. Many of our white European friends who live in very white areas, very white countries, they don't understand why we don't like public transport here in the United States. Why don't you like buses? They're so inexpensive. It's a lot less expensive than maintaining a car and paying for gas. And then they come and visit us. They land in Chicago O'Hare. They get on a bus, and they decide they don't really like it very much either. Now, they might not know why, but they don't like it. So there's a flight from certain businesses as a customer. There's also a flight as an employee. White men and women in diverse areas often end up working in white offices, white warehouses, white lumber yards. They drink at white bars, eat at white restaurants, get their hair cut at white hair salons, and they live among white neighbors. And some of them will even tell you how evil white flight is and how proud they are of themselves for living in such a diverse area. Yeah, you're living in a physically diverse area, but logically, it's not diverse. The places you go to, not the places you go through, form your personal world. White flight creates white personal worlds even within a diverse context. But just like regular white flight, this prevents the person from seeing race. They don't see all of the downsides of diversity. In fact, it may even harden some of them against racial ideas, because when someone like us with a racial worldview tells them about the downsides of diversity, they compare it to their own lives to test the consistency, the truth of these ideas. They say, oh, no, I'm not seeing those downsides, and I live in a very diverse area. Meanwhile, they've purged diversity from their personal world, and they don't even know it. So their world is not a good judge of diversity because they've eliminated it without realizing. So we've got a problem. We need whites to move over to a racial way of thinking. Now, how do we do that? Ultimately, we need to talk to them. And I'm serious. We can talk people into many of these ideas. Now, how can we do that best? Because you need to take a measured approach about this. For one, you can't rant or rave. You can't go off about how a particular race is bad or anti-civilization, because you're just going to play into the whole leftist view of being a foaming at the mouth bigot, that kind of deal. Now, many people on the right, if we don't fall into anger and we don't become that foaming at the mouth bigot, after all, we are living in this far left crazy world, so it is easy to fall that way. For our own mental health, we often just learn to let people say what they want to say. We let it roll off our backs, and we just kind of move on. But that is not getting our ideas spread. Do you see what I'm saying? It's not. We need to engage more. So we need to start looking at conversations differently, right? Every conversation is a chance to plant a seed. So speak courteously, speak truthfully, and make an honest effort to listen to the other person. Now, I have found that people remember things if they are said to them in honest conversation. Even if they can't agree with what you say, they often remember it. And then one day, when they're in Chicago and they see things that strongly evidence everything you've said, that seed can germinate and grow. So if you plant the seed in 50 people, even with a small germination rate, 10, 15%, that might be 7 more people. And they can plant their own seeds in others. Now, I remember when I was about 20, I had a series of conversations with a woman for a few months that I knew her. And we talked about certain topics. We talked about economics, self-reliance, and I didn't agree with her about most things, but I listened. I did listen to what she had to say, and I spoke my own mind. And I don't know what sort of seeds I planted in her head, if they ever amounted to anything. But I remember when I was about 30, a full decade after our conversations, I had never seen her since then, I finally remember looking at a number of sources combined with a decade of life experience, and I thought to myself, wow, she was right about some of that stuff. I still didn't fully recant everything I said to her. I sort of synthesized a perspective that incorporates both some of the truths that I still hold with new truths, some of which came from her honest conversations with me 10 years before. So every time someone seems earnestly willing to listen to your point of view, even if they disagree, take some time to give them some basic facts, figures, and ideas that tie those facts and figures together. That will plant a seed. Seeds are victories, or at least they're the type of victories that we have really significant control over as individuals. What I'm saying is, when we look at conversations with people, the very first thing to determine is, does this person seem like they're actually willing to listen and understand my ideas? Even if they think my ideas are bad, are they a person who actually listens? You get a pretty quick view on whether someone is actually considering your ideas honestly, or if they're just so against it, all they do is wait for you to stop talking so they can start spouting off with their ideas, right? If they're like that, you can just leave. Seriously. But if they seem like they're honestly willing to consider your ideas, even if they hate your ideas, you can plant a seed in them. Now, make sure your seeds are fact-checked. If you say 13% is 50% of violent crime, but 13% is only 40% of violent crime, people will destroy your seeds in their mind. Now, 13% is 40% of violent crime should be plenty of a seed in itself, but people hate falsehood, especially if they think it may have been intentional, and they will give themselves permission to sort of dismiss everything you've said. So let's talk about some seeds. In my video, Multiculturalism is a Joke, one seed you could pull from that is how race and culture are fundamentally connected. And people throughout time, like Abraham Lincoln, knew that. You could also find statistics on how political views are genetically heritable. There are racial components to political views. Add that to an argument. That can be a powerful seed. In my video, Diversity is a Joke, One seed you could pull is to demonstrate how people will say things about whites and white countries that they would never say about non-whites and non-white countries. Double standards are very powerful seeds and do have a high germination rate, but you cannot control which way they germinate, right? You can solve a double standard by making one thing like the other, but you can also solve it by doing the opposite, make the other like the one. So you can't control that. Now, one of my favorite seeds, towards the end of the Diversity as a Joke video, I talk about how diversity requires that we engage in all sorts of conversations and problem-solving tasks with thousands of racial advocacy organizations. If we aren't all living together, we could recoup that effort into useful activities. Those thousands of man-hours could be used for useful stuff rather than constant quibbling about racial justice. Now, how can you force a seed to germinate? Well, you can't force it, but you can encourage it. Now, how you encourage a seed to germinate just requires a little bit of thought on your part. All you got to do is, one, plant the seed, and then come up with the correct germination for that seed. Get the person who has the seed to experience a situation that lends credibility to the seed. Let someone see the truth in real life that your seed explains. If you want to red pill your wife, I don't suggest you drop her off in East St. Louis or drop her off in South Chicago, but exposing her to those types of situations may be what is needed. And I mean that. Feel free to take family and friends to locations that reveal the truth. Just don't get over your head, right? So East St. Louis is dangerous. Now, one thing that you don't want to get caught up in is discussing a single person. A completely white town with one black guy, let's call him Bill, that's a non-starter. Bill will hardly ever bolster your position or germinate seeds, right? You'll often find that when someone is completely alone racially, they act different than when they're with their own people, right? Bill acts differently around people like him. But that's not happening in our town because he's the only one here, right? Bill is just Bill. Bill cannot be the entire barbershop staring down some naive white person and germinating the seed in their head. Bill cannot create bad times because Bill is not himself diversity. He's just one guy, right? It'd be the same thing if you sent a large enough group of non-Japanese people into one Japanese prefecture, right? They could start conflict in these communities. But if you just take one person from that same group that would normally create conflict, if you just took the one person, they could have an absolute fantastic time with the locals because they themselves cannot be a force for social change, changing laws, changing social norms. If they start doing something outside of the norms, like blaring loud music, they can't back that up, right? They have to just stop when they're told to stop. And this is why you'll see white-only social clubs in the South, both sort of official and non-official. If you say you want a white-only softball league in the South, you might get some people to sign up. You'll still have all the people who, are against it, blah, blah, blah. But if the whole town that you're trying to sign this up in is just whites plus Bill, your proposition for a white-only softball league is just... It's basically like, hey, let's start a league, but tell Bill he can't come. And you're going to look like a jerk, right? Legally, if you could open a white-only restaurant, where could you do it? You couldn't do it in rural New Hampshire, right? You couldn't do it in Idaho. The whites there are not conscious enough. You'd have to go to the Carolinas, maybe Mississippi, right? It's not going to work in Maine. So location is very important for germinating these things. So don't get into an argument about Bill, okay? It's fruitless. So now what you need to do is give careful consideration for what seed someone might need, right? Someone who has fundamentally rejected the idea of race as a meaningful concept, if they say, hey, we're all the same, right? They're not a fertile ground for all seeds, right? What they need is the seed of the fact that races are different. You can do that with race and IQ. That's a big one, supported by a lot of scientific evidence. You can go with a softer argument, like what I made in Multiculturalism as a Joke. Once someone has accepted that race matters, and it's not just a optical phenomena, you can take the ubiquity of racial nationalism, like what I talked about in non-white racial nationalism in America, to plant the seed that, for example, non-nationalist white people are in big trouble unless we change. Or you could hit them with the consequences of diversity. Once they accept that races are different, then you can hit them with the negatives. For instance, in my video, Law and Order is a Joke, I made some pretty powerful statements in that one, if I do say so myself. I encourage you to check it out. You might find something useful there. So, in summary, find the white flighters. Plant seeds that are appropriate for them, but don't plant right away. Figure out if this person is actually willing to listen or if they're just spouting off their own ideas. If they're willing to at least give an honest listen, even if they hate your ideas, then you can plant. But if they're not giving an honest listen to anything you're saying, stop wasting your time. Just leave them. So plant the seeds in the people who will listen, and then, if you have time with them, encourage germination. If you don't, leave it. It might take a while, but it can change them.